This is a map that shows where Uganda is in Africa, sort of on the east in the middle, and it is a place where for a long time there have been growing homophobia. For instance, there's a paper called Rolling Stone. It's nothing to do with the American paper called Rolling Stone, which has pushed an anti-LGBTQ agenda for decades, doing things such as this issue shows, publishing pictures of people it claims are top homos in the in Uganda. This is something which I will say has been getting worse for reasons I'll say in a minute, but also there have been protests and attempts to challenge what's been going on. And this has become something of an issue, and many Africans, and I would say this is someone who's lived in Kenya where there's similar attitudes, the laws aren't quite the same, will say that any form of homosexuality, or what is they would call deviant sexuality of any sort, is not African. Africans have a natural, healthy, heterosexual sort of way of looking at things, and anything else has been brought in by decadent people recently. This is the point I want to really start by focusing on before coming on to some other practical things. Why this matters just now is partly because of things that have been happening both around the Commonwealth and around, and specifically in Uganda. So in the Commonwealth, there have been attempts to break away from some of the laws that were passed by the British Empire, and this is going to be the key point. Most of the laws which restrict sexual freedoms of these kinds were ones that were introduced by the British when the British occupied these countries, and for various reasons, many of them are still being kept on. And strangely enough, in just 2018, Theresa May, who was, people may remember at the time, Prime Minister, we get through quite a lot of them at the moment, and she apologised at the date when Trinidad and Tobago was getting rid of these laws, and she said, as the United Kingdom's Prime Minister, I deeply regret both the fact that such laws were introduced and the legacy of discrimination, violence and death that persists today. This was when various people in the government who were passing through these laws abolishing the various anti-gay laws, but interestingly enough, she was then attacked by the Anglican bishop of Trinidad, a certain Bishop Victor Gill, who said that her comments were a form of neo-colonialism because they were insisting that Africans should follow British practices. But this is where I want to move into what Africans following British practices meant. Almost all hang on, I'm going to get numbers right on this. There are 72 countries which have laws, discriminatory laws of these kinds on their books. 38 of them were at some point part of the British colonial empire. And it's because the laws were introduced mostly during the late 19th century, mostly following variations on British laws. What was initially Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, which particularly banned homosexual acts between men, but was something that was really pushed ever since. And for instance, twice as many former British colonies criminalise, well, this is going back to the law. The law was a law specifically against sodomy or anal sex. So that's how it was put in the law. Of these terms, yes, 66% of former British colonies still have a law such as this on the books, when, for instance, in terms of former French colonies, it's 33%. So while there are problems in all sorts of different places, there are more problems in former British colonies. And why were they introduced in the first place? One thing was that the British, as they were spreading round, conquering the world, had a view which was that British, I'm going to make up words here, sensibleness and Protestant work ethic and not worrying about sex and that kind of thing was what got things done. And the problem with lots of people around the world where they were too lascivious and they had strange sexual practices which had to be stopped. And it was partly a matter of controlling people as well. But this was the reason of trying to stamp out what was being done in native cultures. This was done alongside an attempt to put a view of Christianity that was very much against any kind of what they considered non-standard sexual practices. So they introduced these laws and said that anyone who really wants to be part of the modernising wave that we're part of the British Empire, which will take you forward into the future, needs to support these. Africans who argue about this in Parliament and so on will say that this is the traditional African practice. And this is where, oh yes, I missed the slide. That's a boring picture of the law. So I'm going to move on to what's happened in particular in Uganda, where this March an extended law was passed, so they're now intensifying the law which was in place, which introduces, has actually introduced the death penalty rather than the state of imprisonment for what they call aggravated homosexuality. And this was passed through the Ugandan Parliament by a vote of 387 to 2. So, you know, it's not that it was enormously controversial. It has also introduced life imprisonment for recruitment, promotion and funding of same-sex activities. I quote that in particular because I think it, for people who've been around long enough to remember Section 28 in Britain, where it was the Tory government in the 80s that brought in a thing saying that anyone promoting homosexuality would, well, couldn't work and couldn't be done in schools and so on. This is one of the MPs who voted in the picture, John Musila, his name is, wearing a gown which reads, "Say no to homosexual, lesbianism, gay," and some other stuff, but that's enough of that. So this is the attitude now, and this is people saying this is something which has been brought in. So I want to go back 100 years or more to Mwanga's story. Now, Mwanga was the king of Buganda. He was the 19th king of Buganda, so it was a long-standing state. His father had started having dealings with the West, and the way this worked at the time, this is in the 1870s and so on, was that you would have missionaries would turn up. Two lots of missionaries turned up in Buganda. There were Catholic missionaries from Germany and Anglican missionaries, Protestants from Britain. Both of them were closely linked to the imperial powers that they represented, and both of them were trying to say, we will improve things, we will help things for your country. There was a tradition, and this is where the memories come into things. There was a tradition that the king had a right to sleep with his page boys. So he would have people around the court, and it was the king's right to have sex with them. Now, one thing I want to say is most of the things I'm going to say in this talk are not about some kind of ideal queer society or anything like that. What I'm talking about is different ways and different understandings of sexuality. So I do not think that Mwanga was in any way a progressive leader, but he did take it as standard that homosexuality of one sort, and I'm not sure, you know, to what extent this was all consensual, was part of the laws and part of the way that things were run. So, having converted, most of the people had converted to Christianity almost evenly between the two schools of Christianity and refused, and he had them executed. He had 22 Catholics and 23 Anglicans executed. This is, over here is a modern picture of the martyrs. I think it's a Catholic one. But anyway, this led to all sorts of war. It led to troubles with the British, troubles with the Germans, and all sorts of problems. It led to various uprisings that had him overthrown twice by different brothers. But eventually, Mwanga came back to power with the support of the British. Now this may seem odd, having executed a number of people who were supporting, who were executed people who were supporting the introduction of Anglicanism. But from Lord Lugard, that's him pictured at the bottom, I'm standing in front of him, that's him there, saw this as an opportunity to expand the British Empire, and this was the most important thing. You expanded it, you got control, then you imposed laws that would put people in their place and make sure that they didn't break away from what you wanted. So, bizarrely as it may seem, the martyrs were forgotten, and Lugard supported the return of Wanga. Wanga, incidentally, at this point converts to Christianity. He's not a very consistent sort of person in this. I'm not going to go through the rest of the story, which involves him being overthrown again and dying in exile at the age of 35. But Britain, by this time, is firmly in control and has and stays in control for most of the next century. What I think is interesting about this is the splits and things that come up between the imperialists, notably between Britain and Germany. At this period in Europe, just a couple of years, well actually in the middle of these arguments, there is the 1886 Berlin Conference, where the imperial powers are worried that they'll actually end up fighting each other because of these kind of things, where they both try and take over the same state. And as it happens, at the Berlin Conference, this area is sort of given to Britain. So Britain ends up in control of it. But the thing that's interesting is now you both have people saying that any kind of homosexuality is totally alien to Africans, and the establishment martyrs who got the church established in Uganda being killed for refusing homosexual activity. And the Catholic ones have incidentally been canonized. So, you know, they're quite big figures in the Catholic Church. So I want to say something about what this means is that the truth about the history of sexuality in Africa has been forgotten. And I want to just quickly gallop through some things about ideas of sexuality that have been forgotten. First, I'm going to go all the way back to ancient Egypt. I'm just going to mention a couple of things. Here are two pharaohs, both from the 18th dynasty, though that's not particularly important. The first one, the head, is the pharaoh, my pronunciation is going to be awful here, Hatshepsut, who is a woman, and was a woman, but in statues she tends to be represented, but she's certainly with a beard, because pharaohs had beards, and therefore to do a proper statue of a pharaoh they had to have a beard, but also with a slightly masculine figure. The other is the pharaoh Akhenaten, who was a male pharaoh who is often presented with female characteristics, including breasts and wide hips. Now, this may be because he was representing the fertility of the country. It may be because he had some sort of hormone balance that meant that he was more appeared more female. We don't know, and this is the reason I'm showing these two, is to say that a lot of the things you say about sexuality and gender throughout Africa and the history of Africa depends an awful lot on how you interpret what's happened, and sometimes how you interpret relatively small amounts of information. Having said that, I don't want to suggest that all history is so vague that no one really knows. These characters are, oh God, I should have tried hard to pronounce this, Niankhnum and Numhotep, who were buried together, and on their tomb wall as a picture of them, which I think is very suggestive that they were in a sexual relationship. And this is something which is so that this kind of thing, this was in about 2500 BCE, so this is not something newly introduced. This is something that goes back a long time through history. And just in the few minutes I've got left, I want to talk about what kind of things existed in Africa either before or actually sometimes during the period of colonialism. One thing that's interesting is if you look at the anthropologists who went to study the Africans and find out what Africans were like, they often were just wrong on various things. And so Evans Pritchard, who was one of the important ones, did a big study of groups of people, but later on in the 1970s said actually he left out some bits about homosexuality in these societies, which seemed confusing and not very helpful at the time. But all that means is the official guide that says, no, there's no such thing as this, is simply inaccurate. Another one is people just misunderstanding things. So another anthropologist was studying the newer people and asked if there were any variant forms of sexuality, and was told, no, we don't do anything like that. And then later on saw what appeared to him to be two men together in apparently having had some sort of marriage or sexual relationship, and he said, but what about them? And his guide said, oh no, that's completely different, because that person has the soul of a woman, and therefore it's not a homosexual relationship, it's two different people. So the ideas of what gender represents are things which are not at all fixed, and it's very difficult to talk about Africa in general because it's such a varied continent, but you find these things appearing again and again in different places. You also find different ideas about what masculinity is. So for instance, and femininity, but this is a group of young men from the Wadabi people performing what is the Yake dance, which is a dance which young men do to attract women and wives. But in their society, the men wear makeup and try and be beautiful, particularly having clear, beautiful teeth and rolling their eyes, and so on. So what appears to a lot of Europeans to be a very effeminate dance, they regard as a dance which is about their heterosexual relationships. So I'm only mentioning this because it just shows how complicated a lot of these ideas are. And also about the changes that can be put on. I started with the Egyptians talking about the different relationships people had there. This is Queen Zinga of what's now Angola, who resisted Portuguese imperial control for a time. We call her Queen Zinga, but actually among her own people she was called King Zinga, and she had a group of male wives around her. So because she was seen as a king, her consorts were seen as a group of wives in a way that would seem unusual in other things. Now I'm just going to, I've got too much to say about all these things. I just want to bring out a couple of other examples before I stop. Firstly, quite common around many of societies were groups where people would be in sex-divided and age-divided bands. This is the Zandi, who are in Central Africa, most often Southern Sudan. They were particularly feared warriors, but when they would be in bachelor regiments, so that's regiments of warriors who were all in similar age groups, and within those it was quite common for particularly an older man in the regiment to marry a younger man while they were in their warrior phase. He would then probably later go back and marry a woman. But this marriage was an official marriage. He would give a bride price to the other warrior's family. So this was something about different ideas. It was not, they probably wouldn't regard this as it being about homosexuals or homosexuality, but it did involve sex. So it's not that it was not something that happened. Similarly, you have the Dahomey female warriors who, well, I haven't seen it yet, but I think there's a film come out recently about them, who would often take wives, so on. So they often had same-sex partners as well within the group. So again, none of this is saying how all these worked or how they were practical in the long term, but it shows that there were a whole series of separate ideas of what sexuality was. Amongst the Hausa people of northern Nigeria, there are a group of people called the Yandaudu, who tend to be men who appear as female and often wear female clothes. Now people would either probably say they're trans or that they're cross-dressing and so on. But this is something that's been going on since the 18th century, at least in terms of records that people have of it. So it's not something that's been brought in recently from the West. It's something that links in with existing ideas and existing evolution. And I want to just finish with another thing, which is the idea of female husbands. This is coming back to East Africa. This is amongst the Nandi people of Kenya, who have an idea where it is possible sometimes for a woman to marry another woman as a husband, and for this to keep, it's partly to keep property within a family, it's partly to do with worries about infertility, and I believe sometimes it's partly about two women wanting to get married to each other. So there's different things that happen at different stages along the way. But the thing that's interesting to me about this is in one of the countries that has fiercely anti-LGBTQ laws, Kenya, not quite as bad as the ones in Uganda, but still pretty bad. This picture was taken in the 1990s of a couple who are Juliana and Esther Soy, who've been married for a long time and are seen as an established couple. So within this, there are different views of how society is run, and the idea that you can look at Africa in the way that a lot of people in charge in various countries do, saying that we want to be that there is a heterosexual norm and that's the only thing that happens, is a nonsense. I think that's all I've got time to say, so I'm going to stop there and hope people want to stop. It is worth mentioning, which I didn't do before, that about a couple of sources, that I've actually used a lot of sources, but probably the main one is a book called Boy Wives and Female Husbands, Studies in African Homosexuality by Stephen Murray and Will Roscoe. So, so I should just credit that for that. It's also worth mentioning, there's some things I haven't really had time to mention. One of them is things about the role of women and women's sexuality, which I've probably spoken about less. And there's a Nigerian author called, I apologise in advance, Oyeronke Oyewumi, who's written a book called The Invention of Women, which, so just that there is a lot further to go in this discussion. Also, because I left it out simply by skipping through to try and get to the end, I did want to mention something specifically about lesbianism. I did talk about the various female warriors who took wives, but it's worth mentioning another couple of things, such as in Kenya, there has been traditions of lesbianism. There's a word for it, which is wasaga, which perhaps should say literally means grinders, as in when you grind corn. I won't go into the possible reasons for that, but you can. Let's just say that this is common. Or on the other side of Africa, in Ghana, there was someone doing field work. Actually, it's a woman anthropologist doing field work, said lesbian affairs were virtually universal amongst unmarried Akan women, sometimes continuing after marriage. Whenever possible, the women purchased extra large beds. Anyway, I'm not going to go on about that particularly. I just want to say that I think it's something that's a danger sometimes of leaving out, because partly because of the British rules, there was such an obsession with penetrative sex as being the thing that we need to talk about. So, some other things. Firstly, I agree with very much the person who was talking about the Americas and ideas of gender there. For specific reasons, I mean, largely because of Uganda and the fact that Africa really has the most countries that have anti-LGBT laws, I concentrated on this. The things apply really across the imperial world. And as I said, the first laws were introduced in India, which was another place that was seen as sexually decadent when the British arrived. So that's one thing. It's interesting enough, talking about the Catholic Church, one of the things that happened after the arrival of the imperialists, the first of the Portuguese and Spanish in Latin America, was mass dying of the native population. Now, partly this was because they were enslaved and often worked to death, but the reason that they died far more than other people who came later was that they had no resistance to European diseases. The Jesuits, not really knowing the reason for this, came up with an explanation, which was because they were so sinful. They went about naked and they had sex a lot. That's why they deserved to die in these numbers. And we're talking about 90% of the population dying out, so it seems quite a harsh judgment. But anyway, why are things so bad in Uganda? This is something that comes back again and again. I mean, I think there's, in all political things, you can take various general arguments about the way that society is structured, to do with class society, to do with capitalism and imperialism, and various specific things to do with local, the way things develop locally. I think in Uganda there are issues to do with the country's history, specifically its history since independence, which involves civil war, collapse of government and so on after the Idi Amin period, various other things that have happened since. One thing I think is just a general point to make is that particularly African countries, so this applies to lots of post-imperial countries, tend to have very similar borders to the ones that were imposed. Now remember, the borders that were imposed in Africa more than any other continent were imposed in Berlin. It was an attempt by the various imperialist powers not to go to war with each other. They'd noticed that there were some tensions coming up, and they thought if we don't do something about it, this might lead to a big war, which it did, but not in Africa. But that meant that most of borders in Africa are completely arbitrary. Sometimes they go along rivers, more often they're just straight. They go across ethnic groups, they go across social systems, and why have they not been changed since? I mean, there's been attempts to change them, such as in southern Sudan, but what tends to happen is they start raising other questions, and this is similar to what's happening, if you like, with Scotland wanting to break off from Britain. You start raising questions of the way things are, most people aren't very happy with, but we're sort of told you can't change anything. When something big starts changing, then people say, well, if we can change that, why can't we change this other thing? And that's something that most rulers are very afraid of. So they try very hard to stop you worrying about that and start you worrying about something else. And this, I think, is something which you see again and again with politicians, and I don't think African politicians are particularly different from other politicians, is they will say, don't look at that, look at this. And what we want you to look at is these filthy sexual deviants of various sorts, they're causing the problems. It seems like such a ludicrous thing to think anyone would believe that if you hadn't got the trans panic which is going on at the moment in Britain, where, you know, you said that there's a problem with young people today in Britain, which is they're all being forced to become trans. And you would think, well, do think this is such a ludicrous idea that you wouldn't think it was possible that large sections of people would believe it, but a lot of people are going along with it. So, I mean, there's enough other discussions around these issues here that I don't want to go on about that particularly, but I think there's another thing which is also worth going on about, which is a class element to this thing, which is that in Uganda, in other places, and again I know more about Kenya because that's where my family's from, there is a class element which says it's best for social order if the poorer classes, if the peasants, if the people in the shanty towns follow some kind of morality. It goes along with the ideas that were brought up about trying to keep the family going. This is a stabilising element. So that means if I'm middle class or upper class, it's all right for me to do what I like, what I feel that I like, and that includes sexually, but we don't want them doing it. And I think that this is something which comes to a level of hypocrisy that you will see from lots of people who say we need to enforce morality amongst the lower orders. And I think that this is something which has probably been going along as long as there's been class society, but you do see it being emphasised at the moment. I'll come back to that in a minute. Why is it worse in the British Empire? I think that there were degrees up to this. I mean, as various people have pointed out, what the Catholic Church oversaw in the Americas was particularly barbaric. But I think there was an element in the British rulers of what they saw as Protestant abstinence. So they were more, for want of a better word, prudish about sex. And for that, I don't mean that I think that the other rulers, like the rulers of the French Empire or whatever, were particularly progressive or looking forward to caring about the sexual feelings of the people they ruled over. I just think that they had a less prudish view about it. They could still be absolutely barbaric, they could still be ways of forcing large sections of the population into prostitution or all sorts like that, of things like that. But in terms of the specific arguments around homosexuality, I think this was something that fitted with British ideals, as various people, including Amy, talked about during the discussion. It fitted with their advancing, developing ideas, and it did mean that people were talking about changing the laws. There had been laws. Again, going back to the language they used at the time, what were called the sodomy laws, which were brought in particularly about particular sexual acts in the period of Henry VIII, and had gone on, but they were modified by the idea that there were certain kinds of people you had to look out for. So it wasn't that certain people would do things that you had to stop them because they were immoral. It was that now you had the homosexual, who was someone you had to look out for because they were a particular decadent problem who would bring down the morals of society. And this was an idea which was spread about and was encouraged across the empire. So when you train a new middle class and who then become the local ruling class, they have brought in a lot of these ideas. Again, there's more to say about it, but I haven't really got time. But in terms of the attitudes and the way they're pushed, I do think that you can compare a lot to the way that things are done here. I've already talked about the anti-trans stuff, the anti-refugee stuff, which is being pushed by the government at the moment, and has made I think race a central thing in the way that it's been pushed over the past decade or so. You may remember from 2015, well actually going back earlier to the introduction of the hostile environment, there's been a constant thing starting from the government saying it's them, it's them, it's them, they're the problem. So now you've got people who are actually out on the street wanting to burn down refugee hostels because they believe all refugees are paedophiles. This is, again, it's an absurd thing to be arguing, it's an absurd thing to be believing, but when you have a real despair which is going on because of the increased poverty that's being brought into the country by the ongoing austerity, by the fact that there's further recessions coming and so on, for some people it becomes something that's believable. So if you're in an African country where your life has been getting worse rather than getting better, and someone says it's because there are people who are LGBT, some people will believe it, and it's something that can take off if there isn't a resistance movement, which is why I agree very much with people who said we have to actively argue in favour of this. And it's also in favour of people resisting. And also it's something which, if you look at where there have been campaigns and where you actually have a mass resistance movement, it tends to be much more pro-sexual liberation. I don't think it's it's not an accident that South Africa is one of the places that has more progressive laws on these issues. Remember, it was part of the British Empire as well. Some places that were part of the British Empire have changed the laws and have abolished the laws from the British Empire. But I do think we have to say that these are things which are pushed actively by our rulers, as Section 28 was. And there are still people in Parliament who voted for this, in British Parliament, for saying that that promoting homosexuality is something which no teacher should be able to do. Borders. Yes, the thing about the history of what happens before this before colonialism, African history in general is written about. You wouldn't know, for instance, that there was Genu, a city in West Africa that was one of the world's biggest cities in, when's that, 200 BC. Because there's an idea that there was absolutely nothing going on below the Sahara until the colonialists came. It's an absurd idea, but it's something which has been really pushed, despite the fact that there's lots of evidence to the contrary. I agree very much with people who talk about, we call it pink washing, saying we must be progressive because we're pro-gay rights amongst some people. Yes, and it does allow people to say all Muslims are homophobic, or Muslims are mostly paedophiles, or all these sorts of things which the far right are putting across, and it becomes something that's easier. When you have these sort of general rises in prejudice, it becomes easier to put across. So just to finish, let me just say, I was going to say something about, no, I'm going to leave that out altogether. I will come back to the thing about Christian evangelicism and what's happening now. There has always been an issue with religion. I mean, I think if you're going to have a longer talk about this, I think it would be very important to talk about religion and the role that religion has in it. But also that whatever the religion is, whether it's Catholicism or the various Protestant religions, they tend to change their ideas more than people believe they have. And it's interesting at the moment that it's something that's being pushed by the US right, is anti-gay type views, and therefore it is something that's part of what they would call the culture wars, but I think it is part of an attack on various progressive ideas, and it's something that as such we should be part of challenging. I just think finally that this is why socialist ideas are important, why Marxist ideas and understandings of how society has evolved are important, because it allows us to talk about different sorts of societies. It always amazes me that one of the things that we're always attacked for is you want everyone to be the same. You'll say that everyone will be the same. Whereas what I'm saying is, look at all these societies, whether you like this or that about them, people were very different in what they believed, and in the future, as one comment I forgot who it was saying, people will be very different again in the future, and that's one of the things that we look forward to. I probably left something else out for which I apologise, but I better stop there, I think.